what are we going to talk about here today? We're going to talk about budgeting. Now, show of hands, how many people enjoy budgeting? Wow, that was a lot more than I was expecting. So what does budgeting involve? And how does it get involved in cost control? Like, how do they interact? How do they work together? Which one comes first? Do they interact? Do you separate them? Do you integrate them? How does the process work to properly do it? Now, we all know in any financial budget, there is financial data and non-financial data. So what kind of financial data am I talking about here? Where does it come from? No bankers in the room. Lovely. It comes from banks. Now, how many people get information from their bank to incorporate into their budget? Just me. So we get macroeconomic information on inflation rates, on current rates for lending. So we try and incorporate all of that information into our budget. So the question is, how does management take all of this information and incorporate it into their budget? And what kind of best practices are available for management to incorporate these into their budget? And what kind of practices exist currently in industry to help people? And last but not least, let's talk a little bit about the benchmarks. So, who uses budgets? Which department are you in?
To get the data.
Which department? Are you HR? Are you marketing?
Finance.
Finance. Okay, so how does finance use budgets?
Forecasting.
Exactly.
Numbers,
Forecasting. For strategy, exactly. So finance uses budgets to incorporate into strategy. Exactly. Who else uses budgets? You're 2 steps ahead of me, but you're right. For variance analysis, exactly, because we need to figure out why we didn't hit our targets or why we did hit our targets. Sorry, who else?
For the performance management of the company.
Performance management, exactly. Anyone in HR that uses budgets?
Yes. I was in budgeting team
Okay.
for variance analysis.
So you've used budget analysis to determine people or how many people you need?
No, just we were in charge of why we do budget, because also as a role in the variance analysis to compare actual PS budget data.
Perfect.
To highlight for example the overall actual expenses over budget.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. So what I can see here is we all kind of use budgets. HR uses them, accounting uses them, finance uses them, economics uses them. So we take all of this information and we incorporate it into a master budget. So why do we do it? Well, we've got changing economic conditions, and they change rapidly. So we need to design a budget that incorporates all of this changing data into our budgets in order to ensure we've got some sort of cost control. At the end of the day, we're looking at the bottom line here and why we've matched our budget and how we've matched our budget. What does every business need in order to operate? It needs cash. So we're always focused on our cash budget. Accrual accounting is important, but so is cash accounting, because at the end of the day, we need to know how much cash we need. And then once we look at our cash, we also look at our financial requirements. Any bankers in the room? Operating lines? We use operating lines to finance our day-to-day activity. We use our budget to see how much money we actually need. Okay, so the financial and non-financial information. We use interest rates. We use a master budget. We get our information from where? Who uses SAP? Who uses Oracle? Who uses Excel? So there are numerous different software packages that we use in order to incorporate our data. Is there anything else? Any ERP system. Right. So we work carefully with our IT department to make sure that we have the information that we need in order to incorporate into our budget. Right. Okay. Subsidiaries, FX rates. Where does all this information come from? Where else do we get our information from? Well, we go to our back office system, we go to our ERP. Where else do we go? We go to the central bank, right. Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
The industry we're operating in.
Right, we look at our industry, we look at our comparables to see where we should be and where we might be going in the future. Good. Okay, so here we go. Interest rates for, all right, so we got the macroeconomic side and we've got the company side. The macro side, your interest rates. Now, any banker will tell you, with interest rates you have a forecast. Now, I went to a presentation once and there was an economist. And the economist had this little story. And his story was simple. He said, "Fadey, wherever I go, they ask me 3 questions. They ask me where I think the foreign exchange rate will be, where I think interest rates will be, and my age. And I can only get 1 right. So you should always aim for 1 out of 3. But we need to find some way to incorporate all of this information, all of the macroeconomic data, into our forecasts. And what about the company-specific level? What does your company do? Well, at the start and the end, you buy and you sell. Right. You work on what your operation actually does. That's part of what you do. But what else do? You acquire. You divest. What else does your company do? It needs all this information that comes from your CFO, comes from your VP operations, and incorporate it into your budget. Okay, variance analysis. Let's talk about it. How many people do it? What does it entail? It starts with your budget. It compares to your actuals. Why do we do it? Well, we want to know why. Is it a price variance or is it a volume variance? Correct. So we do it to try and help or try to assist our planning in the future. Right. So ultimately, this gets tied into what? It gets tied into our performance evaluation. So how many people here have their budgets tied into their performance evaluations? Okay, so what we're seeing here is we're seeing how budget analysis works with HR to try and improve the process. So how many people get involved in process improvement for their budgets? And what do?
You compare previous results.
Sorry.
We compare previous results. So this year, for example, in the last year, we look at what we budgeted for our processes. We do process analysis, we see where the weaknesses are in our current process, what's lagging, what's keeping us behind. We try to talk to different parts of the business and see where did we go wrong essentially, or where were we at.
See, I think you've made an excellent point here that a lot of people seem to fail or don't seem to realize. The operation drives the numbers don't drive the operation. So what I think we have to look at here is, are our budgets set realistically to what we're actually trying to accomplish? And that's what the variance analysis does. The variance analysis sits there, and we have to sit there and we do it in our Excel spreadsheet and try and figure out what was wrong with my analysis in the first place. So, all right, what's the most popular data or popular software package for variance analysis? Easy question. Excel. Right. So we go in, we pull all of our financials into Excel, and we try and massage the data to incorporate our variance analysis. Okay, it is part of the budgeting process. Now, how often do we do it? Variance analysis is conducted quarterly, monthly, annually. Now, how many of us incorporate that information from the budget, from the variance analysis into our future budgeting process? So we try and incorporate the information that we had into a budget. Now, what do we call a budget that changes, that we look at every 3 months to try and predict the future? A rolling budget, right. So we try and incorporate all of this information into our rolling budget so that we can make an informed decision. Correct. So rolling budgets try to improve the budgeting process to see whether or not if we can improve what we've started. Okay, favorable versus unfavorable. Part of the HR process, what kind of costs do we look at as favorable or unfavorable? Well, the CMA will tell us 3. There was 3 on the test. What were the 3? Labor rate variance. Was I the only one that wrote test 1? Sorry? Material price variance or usage, right. So all of our variances look at either price or usage variances. Now, who's responsible for the price variances? Which departments get involved with the bidding for goods and services? Sorry? Supply. Supply chain management is responsible for making sure that we get our goods and services at the right price. Who else is responsible? Sorry? Procurement. Right, procurement's responsible for the goods and services that we use in production. What other services do we need to pay for? What other parts of our organization do we have to plan for? Labor. So who does the forecasting on labor? Then fast forward up into the 50s and the 60s. Where did the production go? Say it a little louder.
China.
Well, I'm thinking Japan, but I'm working my way there. Right, so I'm seeing production move. Where does production move? If production moves where I can get it done cheaper. So my argument is pretty simple. What happens when you automate the production? What happens to all those warehouses in China, in Japan, where you've got, or Indonesia, or anywhere else, where you've got all these processes that are done by humans? What happens when they start getting done by computers and machines? Then where does the job go? Do you move it back to the US? Canada? I don't know. But my question is, now that I've got this Kaizen processing coupled with all this automation, ultimately you could probably produce your goods, services anywhere. Okay, what's lean manufacturing? What's lean manufacturing?
Simply, it's when you have your production own production will be in one place, so everything will be done in a cycle. So that will be more structured. So the people there will be able to know everything about the production process.
When I think of lean production or lean management or lean manufacturing, I think about somebody literally walking around the floor. Somebody literally walking around the production floor and saying, how can I do this better? So what can I do? Why is this machine operating when there's nobody here? Why is there nobody here when this machine should be operating? So when I think about cost control, lean manufacturing, it really comes down to management figuring out the best way of doing things. And if you think of like the 4 factors of production, and I'm going back to economics here. What are 4 factors of production? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. How do we allocate our 4 factors of production, incorporating cost control to keep our costs down and our profitability up? And whose job is it? Who's ultimately responsible for it? Okay, the ERP system. So we've already spoken about SAP. We've spoken about Oracle. What other ERP systems do we use? Well, we can sit here and tell you how you can become an expert at what you do so that you can become part of the process. Because I don't think we're going to be making hamburgers for much longer. And I don't think we're going to be making cars much longer. But I can tell you that we're going to be responsible for making sure that it's done right and cost efficient. Okay, what happens when we grow? What happens to your company? You need more labor. You need more money. You need more machines. So how do we incorporate this into our budget? Who do we ask? Or do we ask? Does it start at the division level? Or does it start in the CFO's office? How does it work in your company? Well, where I used to be, it started at the operational level. Because ultimately, who's responsible for building roads? Or who's responsible for creating electricity? It's not the treasurer's office. It's the people that are actually building the roads. So how do they communicate with each other? Annually? By email? How do you talk to your controller? Do you talk to your controller? No? Well, okay, then my argument becomes, should the controller send the budget down to you? Or should you send the budget up to the controller? Is there a right way or a wrong way? Sorry?
The controller should request.
The controller should request. And ultimately, the controller can provide feedback. So, is it a two-way street or a one-way street? It should be a two-way street. In order to ensure that you're properly protecting your budget or you're properly budgeting properly, it should be open lines of communication between the controller and the operational level. Okay, training. Is there money for it? And where do we allocate it? How do we allocate training so that we can prove to the CFO or the CEO that it's actually worthwhile? Where do we allocate our training budgets? How many people in their company have a training budget? How many people have seen it been reduced? Sorry, touchy subject. Yeah. What we're seeing here is you're forced as CFOs or CEOs to do more with less. Right. So we use our budget, we use our variance analysis to try and ensure that we're getting the best bang for our dollar. Because at the end of the day, we don't approve the budget. Who approves the budget? The board of directors. Thank you. Well, the board of directors works, the finance part of the board of directors works with the CEO's office, with the Treasury Department, to work out some sort of logical budget. They get their information from operations in order to ensure that it's done right. Okay, production. How do we make sure it's done properly? People. What are we going to sell? Where does this information come from? Well, when I used to do it, I hated it. I absolutely hated it because I sat there and I tried to create a 5-year budget on a company that was growing by 18% per year via acquisitions. So how did I do it? Yeah. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. But the question I have for you is, as long as you can support the numbers that you're getting, is it okay? Or how do we do it? Okay, so we talked about comparing to industry. Do we use a comparable comparable budget for a competitor to create our own budget? If you're McDonald's, do you look at Burger King's budget to create your budget? No? Why not?
Maybe the process in McDonald's is not the same as in Burger King.
Perfect. Perfect. So, even though we're in the same industry, even though we're doing the same thing, we're both selling hamburgers, maybe the process is different. So, sometimes we can compare ourselves to industry, and sometimes we can't compare ourselves to industry. Now, let's talk about strategy. Do McDonald's and Burger King have the same strategy? Does Ooredoo have the same strategy as QP? No, different. So how does a company differentiate itself for its budget? Well, it all comes down to strategy. And who ultimately is responsible for the strategy? Is strategy driven from the CEO's office, or is it driven from the department or departmental managers? Whoa, okay. All right, sorry, you don't have to answer this question. Which company do you work for?
Ayan leasing company in Kuwait.
Okay, so you drive the strategy for your division?
No, the management, the CEO and the senior managers
Right.
doing the strategies, and they present it to the boards then.
And who designs the budget?
The budget is a participative budget. Every department, every sector, they have to participate in preparing the budget. That's why it's an effective budget. Then we can measure the performance properly during the year.
You just said the magic word. You said participative. So what's a participative budget?
Every sector, every department, they have to put their numbers, but of course we have to discuss
These numbers with them because to avoid the budgetary slack we don't have to make it participative 100% and not to be imposed by management 100%. We have to how can we say, we balancing the budget to reach what is better for the corporation.
Well, you just summed up this entire practice for me. So what was the title? What was the title of my presentation?
So I will go to make the presentation.
Best practices for cost control. And I really think you've answered my question. I really think this has to be a participative process in between the divisions that are involved to make sure that it works properly. Okay, the benchmarks. What are my four ratios? I'm back to class now. What are my four ratios? Where do I divide my ratios by? I divide my ratios by, they're right there. Number one, liquidity. Right, who's interested in your liquidity ratios? Your bankers. Right, your leverage ratios. Who's interested in those? Sorry?
Lenders?
Lenders. Okay. How many people do reporting on debt covenants? Which debt covenants do you report? Are they part of your reporting requirements to your company, to your bank?
Yes, they are.
Do you mind taking the mic?
Yes, they are.
Which ratios do you report?
Debt service covenant.
Debt service, right. I'm teaching this one in class right now. What formula do you use? EBITDA over debt service? Or debt service over EBITDA? EBIT. Okay. This is really funny. Will you find EBIT? Is EBIT defined? If you look at CMA or you look at the ACCA or if you look at any accounting or any accounting body, is there a formal definition for EBITDA? Is it there? Is there a problem with reporting EBITDA? What's the problem with reporting EBITDA? Well, depreciation in and of itself is basically manipulated by management. Yes. So when you manipulate the numbers that are reported to your to your service requirements, you might run into a problem when it comes to industry analysis. Okay. Are there any questions? Is there anyone else that does any sort of debt service or anybody that does any sort of reporting to an external body? No? Go ahead.
We prepare a general ledger
Okay.
as per the requirements. We first ask for the requirements as per what they ask for. And then we prepare a general ledger.
Right.
And we have a discussion if there is any doubts, and that's all. He makes a report out of it.
So how does it get incorporated into your budgeting process?
They come and check the whole process, and they ask how the process is going on. because every organization have a different process. So the first thing is they check our system first, and then they check whether is it true or false.
Okay, so every company has a different process. So every company has a different process, which makes budgeting that much more complicated. And at the end of the day, any best practices that come down to budgeting ultimately have to be looked at from the industry level and the company level. Anything that applies to banks may not apply to utilities. Anyone else involved in the budgeting process that would like to discuss it? No? Okay. I just want, sorry.
I have a question that has been from last year when we had this conference in Jordan about
About the digital transformation. Can you link all of the concept to the digital transformation?
Digital transformation. Well,
Still human has effect on what you have said.
you know what? That's an interesting question. If you look at what we were talking about today, if you're looking at some of what we're looking at today, our biggest challenge is we're moving away from human intervention in the processing of information. It's all being automated. You look at how human hands aren't touching numbers anymore. So where do humans become responsible? Now humans become responsible for making sure that the strategy is implemented properly. So your question was on...
How can I link all of this to the digital transformation? Shall all go to the digital transformation?
Well, that's an excellent question. Where does your information go into? It goes into your ERP system. So it goes into your ERP system, and ultimately you try to translate it into becoming information that you can use. So how much information is available? And how much is actually relevant? If your banker sits there and tells you that, here are forecasted US CAD FX rates for the next 5 years, are they relevant?
Thank you so much, Mr. Fadey. I would like to invite you on the stage to receive your token.